18th century shirts are my very favorite kind of shirt. I made my first attempt at one back in 2014, and now they're the only kind of shirt in my wardrobe. Most of them in very inaccurate colors for the 18th century, but all with the same basic rectangular construction. In this video I'm going to show exactly how I machine sew a shirt. I don't know how many I've made at this point, but it's definitely more than 40. Only 5 or 6 of them were completely by hand, and the rest of them have varying amounts of hand and machine sewing. Since this video will focus mainly on machine construction, it's obviously not going to be completely historically accurate, but I hope it'll be useful to anyone who wants to make one relatively quickly, for costuming purposes or for everyday wear. I do eventually want to make a hand-sewn shirt video as well, so I'll try not to go off on too many tangents about how I would do things differently by hand. The cut is the same either way, and the overall construction is somewhat similar. If you are planning on making a hand-sewn version, I've put some stuff about that in the blog post, which is linked in the description. Previously, whenever someone asked me about shirt construction, I would link to a blog post I wrote back in February 2020, but I've been wanting to update that post for quite a while, so I also have new written instructions up on the blog. They're not quite as detailed as the video, but hopefully still thorough enough. I'm sewing this one up in a bright color and reluctantly putting the word pirate in the title to indicate that this is the slightly more costumey, less historically accurate version. And because I think the less familiar someone is with 18th century shirts, the more likely they are to search for pirate shirt, and those people will need specific instructions. Although, vampire shirt would also be a good title. For this shirt I'll be using a lightweight teal linen. This is not a remotely accurate color for 18th century shirts, which were usually, but not always, plain white linen. But this is for my everyday wardrobe, and it's nice to have a variety of colors. I find linen most comfortable for shirts, and I think it has a nicer drape, but I've also made some cotton ones, and if it's your first shirt, it's probably best to go with something not too expensive. It should be fairly thin. There's a lot of fabric in these shirts, and a thick material will get bulky very quickly, but I will talk more about fabric later in the video. One of the many wonderful things about 18th century shirts is that they're made entirely of rectangles, so you don't need a pattern, you just need a set of dimensions for all the pieces. I'm not great at math, so I don't have any fancy formulas to calculate how big all your pieces should be. The best I can do is to go over all my pieces one by one and compare them to my measurements. When cutting out a shirt, it is very important that you write everything down. Write down the dimensions of all your pieces, how long you cut the front slit, and how much you leave closed at the shoulder, and everything like that. Write it all down, and then the next time you make a shirt, you'll have all that information for reference. If you're worried about keeping track of which piece is which, you can pin little labels onto them as you cut them out. And if you forget, you can always measure it and figure out which one it is by comparing it to the sheet where you wrote everything down. Because you did write everything down, right? The measurements of some of these pieces depend on the measurements of the other pieces around them, so there's not really a logical order to present them in, but I like to cut them in decreasing order of size. First, you need to even up the end of your yardage, which should already be washed and ironed. All the cutting in these shirts is done by pulling threads. The end of this piece was rather uneven, so I started on the shorter side. You just make a little clip in the edge of the fabric, find one thread, and carefully pull on it, and you'll get a straight line to cut along that's perfectly on grain. The thread will probably break, and you could pull the end out again with the tip of a pin, but I prefer to cut along the edge of the pulled thread as far as I can, and then continue pulling. Even if the thread is still in the fabric, it should be visibly different from the other threads around it if it's moved a little and caused a ripple in the fabric. This method is pretty easy with linen, but it can be very frustrating with tightly woven cottons. If you use a fabric with a woven stripe or plaid pattern that you can cut along without pulling threads, it'll go a lot faster. You may be tempted to tear your fabric, but do not do this, especially not if it's linen. You'll end up with horrible scraggly edges. If you're using a cotton bedsheet, then you can probably get away with it on the bigger pieces, but you'll have to make them a few centimeters too big, and then go back and trim all those nasty edges off. They will be stretched and frayed, and you cannot fill the seam allowances nicely when they're in that condition. The main body of the shirt ought to be cut all in one piece, if possible. A properly historical one should be almost knee length, but sometimes I cut them to mid-thigh length, or a bit shorter. As long as there's enough fabric to tuck into your pants, it should be fine. You can measure from the top of your shoulder down to 1 centimeter lower than you want the hem to be, and double that number. I've got a 2 meter cut of linen here, but having lost a bit of length to shrinkage in the wash, and from evening up the ends, my shirt body ended up 1.9 meters long. If your fabric is a weird shape that necessitates cutting the body in 2 pieces, that's okay, just do 2 identical ones half as long. The width of the body depends on the width of the fabric I'm using. 18th century fabrics were a lot narrower, and they cut their shirt bodies to the full width of the linen they were using. With modern fabrics, you can usually fit the body and the sleeves side by side. I like to cut my sleeves square at 59 or 60 centimeters, and this teal linen is 133 centimeters wide, so that leaves a body piece 74 centimeters wide. However, this golden cotton lurex blend is only 109.5 centimeters wide, so I cut the sleeves 48 centimeters wide and the body 61.5, which is a lot narrower than I prefer the body to be, but I didn't want to compromise too much on sleeve puffiness with this one. Another one where I was very short on fabric is this printed cotton shirt, which has a body cut 64 centimeters wide and sleeves cut 44.5 centimeters wide. The widest part of my hips is 109 centimeters, and this gold shirt has a finished circumference of 116, and I would not want to go any tighter than that. My usual shirts made from wider linen have a circumference of about 138 to 140 centimeters. They can be much wider though. This red cotton voile was woven 1 meter wide, and it was a pretty long piece, so I left the body the full width of the fabric, making the finished circumference 195 centimeters. The sleeves are also 1 meter wide, which is very fun, but would not work with the thicker fabric. This stuff is semi-sheer, and the sleeve gathers still made the wristband somewhat bulky. Find the shoulder point on each of the long edges by folding them in half. I'm marking them with fabric pencil. You will need to cut a T-shaped opening in the middle of the body piece for the neck hole and front slit. The width of the neck opening doesn't matter because it will be gathered down. The important part is how much you leave closed for the shoulders. This will depend on your shoulder measurement, where exactly you want the top of the sleeve to sit, and the size of your neck gusset. I'll talk about it more when we get to the neck gusset, but for now I'm leaving 16 centimeters closed here. I measured in from the shoulder points on both sides and marked where the ends of the neck opening will be. I cut it by pulling threads, as usual, but had to start by sticking a pair of snips through the weave of the fabric and clipping a tiny bit, so I could get the end of the thread out. I tried to get it lined up along the grain as closely as possible to the shoulder point I marked on the edge. I pull the thread until the line it makes reaches the mark on the other end of the neck opening. Then you need to cut the front slit, and once again it's easiest to find the middle by folding it in half. Just like the neck opening, I mark a little perpendicular line and pull a thread until I reach it. You can stand in front of a mirror and measure down from your neck to decide how long you want the slit to be. I make mine anywhere between 25 and 32 centimeters, but if you have the bumpier variety of chest, you might want to make it shorter. These things only have buttons on the collar, so they're either buttoned up or all the way open. It's up to you though, and it shouldn't gape very much if you're wearing a waistcoat or jacket over it. If you do make it shorter, just make sure that the slit length plus the collar length minus the 4 combined seam allowances is enough to fit easily over your head. If you can see the entire length of the shirt ruffle in a portrait, it should give you a good idea of how far down on the torso the end of the slit is. As previously mentioned, I usually cut my sleeves 59 or 60 centimeters long, and that exact length will also depend on how low you want your shoulder seam to sit. The tip of my shoulder to my wrist measures 57 centimeters, which is about the same as the length of the finished sleeve once you take a centimeter of seam allowance off each end. But you also need a bit more length in order to move your arm around, and my shoulder seam is slightly dropped on most of my shirts. On this teal one, it's 3, maybe 4 centimeters lower than the point of my shoulder. You want the end of the sleeve to poof out nicely, but not to sag and cover the wristbands. So I guess arm length plus seam allowance is good if you're doing a sleeve seam that's a few centimeters lower than the shoulder. And if you want it right on the shoulder, then you can add a few more centimeters. And subtract a bit if you want the seam to be dropped even lower. These ones are 59 centimeters square. The top of the sleeve will have some gathering, and a gathered seam allowance can't be neatly filled, so you need a strip of fabric to cover it and finish off the inside. This should be 2 centimeters longer than the edge you will attach the sleeve to. I gather my sleeves down and sew them on with a 42 centimeter long seam, so I make my armhole bindings 44 centimeters long. I cut them 3.5 centimeters wide, but you can make them a lot wider if you want. Some extant shirts have very large ones that reinforce the shoulder area. I find that the shoulders are never the first part to wear out on my shirts, but I imagine the extra layer would be helpful if you wear things slung over your shoulders a lot. I cut these on the straight grain because it helps them behave better when you sew them on. The collar is pretty easy. It's just your lower neck measurement plus seam allowance and overlap. Be sure to put the measuring tape at a tightness that feels comfortable. My lower neck measures 40 centimeters, so with a 1 centimeter seam allowance at each end and a 1 centimeter overlap, that gives me a collar piece that's 43 centimeters long. I'm cutting this one on the straight of grain so there's less chance of it stretching out. For the width, just take whatever height you want the finished collar to be, double it, and add 2 centimeters for the seam allowance. I want this one to be 7 centimeters high, so I cut it 16 centimeters wide. Collars are pretty short in the early 18th century, and stayed mostly on the shorter side until about the 1780s, but there is some variation. The shoulder strips reinforce the top of the shoulder, and the length of them will depend on how long the closed portion of the shoulder is on the body, as well as the size of the neck gusset. I cut mine 22 centimeters long and 3 centimeters wide. I'd recommend cutting them a bit longer than you think you'll need, just in case. You can make them a little wider if you want, but probably not much narrower than this. I'm cutting these on the cross grain because they have to go over an angled surface, and I prefer to give them that extra bit of stretch, but straight of grain works too. The wristbands are typically very narrow. They turn into pretty wide cuffs around the very, very end of the 18th century to the beginning of the 19th. But broadly speaking, if it's an 18th century shirt, the wristbands are tiny. That's one of the things I got wrong in my first half dozen or so shirts because I wasn't really paying attention to the reference pictures, and I just made them the same width as modern dress shirt cuffs. But no, they should not be much wider than the buttons they're fastened with. Because the fabric is thin and the shirts have no interfacing, and there are bulky gathers from the sleeve at one edge of the wristband, you often get this annoying little ridge, and that side of the buttonhole gets all stretched out. I find it helps to make the seam allowances the same width as the wristband, so that they go all the way to that edge and make it more substantial. I like my finished wristbands to be 1.5 centimeters wide, so I cut the pieces 6 centimeters wide. I do not think multiplying it by 4 would work well for wide shirt cuffs though. That would probably be very wrinkly and bunchy and bad. I've only done it for narrow wristbands. Now, if you're not trying to be historically accurate, you can give the wristband an overlap and sew a button onto it, but if you want a proper 18th century wristband, you should make it to be fastened with sleeve links. I have a video on making sleeve links. They're super easy, and you just need a couple of big jump rings and 4 metal shank buttons. I make most of my shirts to take sleeve links, not because I feel any obligation to be historically accurate in my everyday wardrobe, but because I find they sit better on my wrist that way. Sewn-on buttons work fine for wide shirt cuffs, but whenever I put one on a wristband I regret it. I just don't think it looks as nice. It does work better the wider you make the cuffs, but then they look less 18th century. I aim for a finished wristband that's 1.5 centimeters longer than my wrist measurement, which gives me just enough ease to comfortably fasten the sleeve buttons. But if you're using a stiff cotton, you might want to give it a little more ease. It's best to cut these on the straight of grain so they don't stretch out too much. My wrist measures 16.5 centimeters around, so with the 1.5 centimeters of ease and the 1 centimeter of seam allowance for each end, that makes a wristband piece that's 20 centimeters long. The underarm gussets are squares that give you a little more room under the sleeve. I cut mine 14 centimeters square. They would still work if they were a bit bigger or smaller. The neck gussets are also squares, but smaller than the underarm gussets. They get folded in half to create a triangular insert, which helps give the shoulder some shape, because your neck and your shoulder do not meet at a perfect 90-degree angle. For a long time I was cutting mine at 8 or 8.5 centimeters, but that seemed a bit too small, so I did a few at 12 centimeters. But those were too big, and gave me less room in the collar to gather the body into, so for this one I've cut them 10 centimeters square. It might be good to wait and cut the neck opening and the shoulder strips after you've cut these, so you know how much shoulder length you'll need. If you fold the gussets in half diagonally, line up the tip with the very edge of the shoulder, and subtract 4 centimeters for the 4 combined seam allowances, it should give you an estimate for how long the shoulder will be. These altogether are 23 centimeters, and the finished shoulder is 19. These little gussets reinforce the vents at the bottoms of the side seams. I've been calling them hem gussets, but I guess side seam gussets would be a more appropriate name. I cut them 5 centimeters square, but 5.5 or 6 would be easier to sew on. And then one more little square for the front slit reinforcement, which I always cut without measuring, but this one's 4.5 centimeters. Normally I fold it in half diagonally and round off these corners like so, to make it a heart, but you can also leave it a square if you want to. Both shapes can be found on extant shirts. I'm not sure exactly when they started appearing, because there are not many photos of extant examples and they're never visible in portraits, but I always add them. There are shirts without them, and I've made some, but those are the only ones I've ever had tear in the front. In fact, they tend to get little holes right where the patch would be, and then I have to patch it anyways, so you may as well do it now. Here's all the scraps I had left from my 2 meters of fabric. Ruffles will be covered in a separate section near the end of the video. Now we're finally on to the sewing. The first thing we need to do is finish the front slit with a narrow hem. I fold over about 4 millimeters and then fold it again and pin it. You'll have to taper it down to nothing at the bottom of the slit, but don't worry about that little bit of raw edge, it'll be covered up soon. Then I baste it with a running stitch using old cotton thread. Once it's basted, I can easily sew right along the edge with the machine. If you hate hand basting, I understand, I used to hate it too, but it turns out it's really, really useful and makes a lot of things faster and easier, so I'm going to do a lot of it in this video. And you should try it. It will make your narrow hems and flat felled seams much easier and more even. It does depend a lot on the fabric though. I don't baste nearly as much when using stiff cotton, but I find it to be essential when working with something that's a bit wiggly, like linen. For my colored shirts I usually use polyester thread because it's easy to find matching colors, and it holds up to a lot of wear. I set my stitch length pretty short, slightly longer than a millimeter. Just stick to the edge as closely as you can when going around the bottom. I usually pull out the basting immediately after sewing the thing it was holding. The patch should be sewn onto the inside of the shirt, so the same side as the hems. It can be tricky to fold all the edges in, but it helps if you crease the curved part with your thumbnail. Linen tends to hold a crease really well, even if you're just pressing it with your hands. If possible, spread the shirt body flat on a table while you pin the heart on, and then baste it on. If you hand baste nothing else on this shirt, at least hand baste this part. The little indent at the top of the heart should be even with the bottom of the slit. Leaving a fairly long tail of thread, I top stitch it in right around the outside edge. I have to lift the presser foot and pivot the fabric when going around the curves, and I use the hand wheel for a lot of it. You can stop after you've gone around once, but when I get back to the beginning I like to take 2 stitches down into the heart and then go around a second time. Leave a long tail when you cut off these threads, so you can tie them off by hand. I like to do a square knot and bury the ends under the heart, making sure they're not sticking through on the outside. Now we need to cover up that little bit of raw edge at the bottom. For this I usually use cotton pearl or crochet cotton, just like I do for buttonholes. For my colored shirts it can be difficult to find a good match, so I often have to settle for a color that's close enough. I wax the very tip of the thread to help it stick a bit better. Mark a spot about 1 centimeter up from the bottom on either side of the slit, bring the thread up through the hem, and then start doing buttonhole stitches around the edge. At the bottom you should be able to catch the edges of both the shirt front and the heart piece. To reinforce the bottom even more, and to prevent it from gaping open as much, we need to do a bar tack. This ought to be fairly close to the bottom. Bring the thread down through the hem to the level you want it to be at, and make a few stitches across the opening. Then do buttonhole stitches across that clump of threads. I finish the thread off by waxing it and burying it in the hem. I have tried doing the buttonhole stitches only on the tiny bit underneath the bar tack, but that leaves a small weak hem right next to a stiff sturdy bar tack, making it much more prone to fraying and tearing, so it's better to have the buttonhole stitching come up a bit higher than the bar tack. I usually do the heart-shaped patches, but some 18th century shirts have a diamond-shaped reinforcement, and those ones are even better suited to machine sewing. For that kind you'll have to start it before you hem your slit opening, and you'll also need to leave at least the bottom few centimeters closed. Take a square of about 4 centimeters, line up the middle of the square with where you mark the bottom of the slit, and mark a V shape where you will sew it on. The top part of the V needs to be wide enough to include all the material that gets folded over for the bottom part of the hems. I marked my V about 16 millimeters wide so I can fold over 8 millimeters on each side and have a finished hem that's about 4 millimeters. The V should also stop a few millimeters in from the edge of the fabric so you can turn all the edges under. Do not start sewing right at the edge of that square. Switch to a very small stitch length and sew around the V, being sure to backstitch at both ends. Then just cut the rest of the slit open down to the point, being very careful not to cut through the thread, and turn it right sides out. Fold the edges in and baste them. You can sew it all in one with the hem, or sew the hem first and then the patch second, but I'm doing it all in one here. The turned edge along the bottom has already finished and somewhat reinforced the raw edge that's there on the heart-shaped one, so the buttonhole stitches are optional, but I still recommend doing the bar tack. The reinforcements on most of my shirts are the same fabric as the shirt, but I tried putting a red one on this black shirt, just for fun. If you're going to do a contrasting one on the inside, it should be lighter than the main fabric so it doesn't show through, but if you want to, you could also put one on the outside. Not at all historically accurate as far as I'm aware, but if it's for your everyday wardrobe, or for a more historical fantasy sort of costume, then you can do whatever you want. Except for machine sewing on the heart patch without basting it first. Don't do that. Baste it or it will be wonky and you will get stabbed by lots of pins. If your cutting layout required you to cut the body in 2 pieces, now is the time to sew up the shoulder seams, but make sure your seam allowances are on the outside. The reason you want them on the outside is because this part will be covered up by the shoulder strip later. If you leave them on the inside like a normal seam, then they'll have to be finished separately, which would be more bulky and also a waste of time. Sew up the same amount you would have left closed if you'd cut the body in one piece. I recommend using a pretty narrow seam allowance, so you don't have to trim it in order to fully cover it up later. Take your net gussets and press all 4 edges in. After pressing the first 3, I like to check the length of the sides like this, to make sure the square is as even as I can get it. Of these 4 corners, only one will be exposed in the final shirt, the one that's sewn down to the inside. The one opposite that will be on the outside and will be covered by the shoulder strip, and the remaining 2 will be inside the collar. To help reduce bulk, I like to unfold those 3 and trim the entire corner off the seam allowance. Lay your shirt flat on the table with the inside facing up, and place the one corner you didn't trim about 1 centimeter in from the end of the neck opening. Pin the edges on, overlapping the edge of the neck opening by about 8 millimeters, but curve the corners out so they're right on the edge. Then top stitch it down. Once both of those are sewn to the inside, you can fold them to the outside. The edge should overlap that line of stitching by just the tiniest bit. If the edges aren't lying nicely, you can clip a little ways into the corner. Since I want to get these lined up as precisely as I can on top of the underneath halves, I baste them before sewing them. I tie a knot at the start of my basting thread, but I always try to leave it out of the way of where I'm going to sew, so I don't have to dig it out from underneath the stitching. And then top stitch them down the same way. Because we sewed the inside halves first, only one line of top stitching is visible on the outside. Press the long edges in on the shoulder strips. I fold the neck gussets in half to mark the middle point, and there should already be a shoulder mark at the middle of the long edge on the body piece, but I'll go over it with marker so it's easier to see. Because we're sewing a flat piece onto an angled surface, I like to baste it first. Pinning it still works, but I find that to be more annoying, especially with linen. Make sure you're sewing it onto the outside of the shirt. It's easiest to go straight across the neck hole from one side to the other. My shoulder strips were a little too long, so I had to trim off the ends. Now that your shoulders are all assembled, it's time to do the collar. In order to get it centered, fold it in half and mark the middle. I'm using my clear grid ruler to mark a stitching line 1 centimeter in on 3 of the edges, which is not strictly necessary, but it is helpful. I then fold those collar halves in half to mark the shoulder point, excluding the bit that will be the seam allowance on the ends of the collar. Mark the middle of the back of the neck hole in the same way. Now it's time for gathers. You can use the same thread you're sewing with, as long as it's strong enough to not snap, but I'm switching to a contrasting thread so you can see it better. For gathering, I set my stitch length to 3.5 millimeters, which is the longest my machine can do. Though my machine is too old to know what a millimeter is, and it uses some kind of nonsense called a per inch. Your first line of gathering stitches should be on the seam allowance, a few millimeters out from where the seam will be, and the second one goes on the outside of where the seam will be. I try to start them in the same place, but the stitches never line up perfectly. Both need to go all the way around the neck opening. I try to keep the two lines an even distance apart, but I've been having a lot of trouble with the speed control in my sewing machine lately, and it goes even faster with a long stitch length. I took it to get serviced and the repair guy couldn't find anything wrong with it, so I apologize for the fast, jerky motion of the sewing machine. It simply will not go slowly anymore. While you've still got the machine set up for gathering, mark the middle of the tops of your sleeves and sew gathering stitches on the middle 2 quarters, then set them aside for later. Getting back to the neck, we need to gather down all this width so the points marked on the collar can be matched up to the ones on the body. I'm not gathering the neck gussets, so I cut the thread in the middle of those, and then I can pull the threads on both ends of each section of gathering. It doesn't matter whether you're pulling the top or bottom threads, just as long as you're pulling on the same thread on both ends. A common way of evening out hand gathers is to stroke them with a pin, but that doesn't really do much for machine gathers, so just smoosh them around with your hands until they look evenly distributed. I match up the center, back, and sides, and pin the front edge of the body just inside where I drew that seam allowance line on the collar. Gathers are, I think, the most obvious difference between hand and machine sewn shirts. The machine gathers are never as fine and even as the hand sewn ones, and it's not the gathering stitches so much as the way the seam itself is constructed. With machine sewn gathers you put right sides together and sew them like a normal seam, but for the hand sewn gathers on 18th century shirts you press in the seam allowance on the ungathered edge and lap it over top of the gathered one. Then you sew it down with whip stitches on the outside, putting one whip stitch through each gather, and they come out just as tiny and perfect as can be. For my first few hand-sewn shirts I did not know to do that, and I backstitched and turned them like a regular seam, and they were consequently very uneven. Here you can see why 2 lines of gathering makes things much more even. When you sew down the middle they're held in on both sides, but if you were to sew along one edge of a single line of gathers, they would bulge all over the place and be much larger and less even. I don't like to sew over pins, but I also prefer to keep the pins in when sewing down gathers, so I go over the seam twice. On the first pass I go slowly using a long stitch, somewhat shorter than the one I used for the gathering. Here I'm crawling along with just the hand wheel, because of the aforementioned machine speed problem. Then I pull out all the pins and inspect the gathers for horrible wonkiness, because if there is any it's much easier to fix now. I also like to trim the long ends of the gathering threads at this point, so they don't get in the way. And then I switch back to the small stitch length and sew over the seam a second time. If your shirt body is cut very wide, you may wish to put some of the gathers into the shoulder gussets as well as the collar, in which case you'll have to do the gathering at an earlier step. Mark the halves on each of the front edges and quarters along the back. Sew your 2 lines of gathering stitches on the back and both the front edges, making sure to leave thread tails at the corners. Pull the gathering threads on the section nearest the shoulder until it's small enough to fit the gusset, and then pin and top stitch it down, just as before. Once the first half is sewn down, I like to cut the gathering threads in the middle of the gusset and pull those tails out, because it's difficult to get all the gathering thread out once the other side of the gusset is sewn down. You'll still have those gathering threads left in the rest of the neck opening, and after you've put the shoulder strip on, you can use them to gather the body into the collar as usual. I've only done it this way on a few of my shirts because the fabric is usually too narrow to have that much extra, but I do all my nightgown shoulders that way. Getting back to the collar, press it up away from the body and press the seam allowance in on the long edge. Fold the collar in half lengthwise, right sides together, and line up that edge with the bottom of the collar. Sew up the sides from the bottom. Always from the bottom, because if you went from the top then the fold might not end up in the right place. I like to trim off just these corners, but nothing else. No trimming the seam allowance on the front edges, because you'll need that stability for the buttons, especially if you've got a very lightweight fabric. Now I'm turning it right sides out with a bamboo point turner and pressing the edges. I'm pulling the exposed gathering thread out and leaving the stuff inside the collar because it's lighter than my fabric. But if your gathering thread is noticeably darker than your fabric, I'd suggest taking it out so that it doesn't show through. I could finish up the collar at this point, but since I do it the same way as I do the wristbands, I'm going to leave it till then. Now it is the good and correct and easy time to attach the sleeves. Sewing them on at any point later than this would be more difficult and less efficient, so we'd better do it now. Lay the body wrong side up on the table and mark the middle of the shoulder and where you want the sleeve to end on either side of it. My sleeve attachment seam is 42 centimeters, so I make a mark 21 centimeters away on either side of the shoulder point. I'm going to gather the sleeve down, not to the distance between the marks, but so that the edges are 1 centimeter past the marks. The marks are where the stitching is going to end, and we need some seam allowance protruding past that. Most of the time I don't have a particularly huge amount of extra sleeve material, and the gathers look nicer if they're fairly full and concentrated near the top of the sleeve. As with the collar, I'm switching to a longer stitch length to sew over the pins on the gathered section, but I don't need to go back and sew over the seam a second time because that's going to happen when the armhole binding is added. Since I cut it 2 centimeters longer than my sleeve attachment seam, it's now the same length as the end of the sleeve. Pin it on top of the sleeve. The gathered sleeve should be sandwiched in between the body and the binding. Sew it from the body side so you can make sure you're going over the exact same seam. There should still be that 1 centimeter of seam allowance sticking out past either end. On the binding, take that seam allowance and press it inwards. Clip into the sleeve and body seam allowances like so, stopping right at the end of the seam. Then clip in from the side on the sleeve only so that you've removed a tiny square. Do not cut anything off the binding piece. Press the seam so that the binding is facing in towards the body and the sleeve is sticking out away from it. I like to leave the binding seam allowance alone, but trim off half the seam allowance from the body and sleeve to get rid of some of the bulk from those gathers and the end of the shoulder strip. Tuck the long edge in and pin the binding down to the body. This is another part that I always baste. I find it always wrinkles up if I just sew it with pins, even though I cut it on the straight of grain. Top stitch it down to the inside of the shirt. With your sleeves on, the whole thing should now resemble a giant plus. Brief interruption just to say that I have a Patreon. It started off just being for dinosaur comics, but recently I've also been doing monthly updates on sewing video stuff that I'm working on. I feel like I'm not very good at Patreon, and I'm still not sure what the best things to post on there are, but I am open to suggestions. Don't worry, I will never hide useful sewing information there, only silliness and behind-the-scenes stuff. I do not make very much money off of YouTube, especially since I despise mid-roll ads, although I'm kind of in one of those right now, aren't I? So a very big thank you to my patrons for making this video possible, and helping me to afford the supplies for this backdrop I painted. I also have a spoonflower and a Redbubble, though it has been much too long since I've drawn any new repeating patterns for them. Back to the shirt now. Before sewing the underarm gussets, it's helpful to draw the seam allowances on so you know exactly where to line up the corners. I'm drawing mine 1.5 centimeters in from the edge. This will go in the space where the body and sleeves meet, and it fits nicely because they're both at right angles. I stick a pin through the corner of the marked stitching line so I can line it up with the corner of the armhole binding, and I pin it on with another pin before taking that one out. And sew it on, making sure to stop at the corner where the marked lines intersect. If you're sewing from the body or sleeve side, you probably want to mark that point on the piece opposite the gusset so you can still see it. Fold it the other way like this, and then you can pin and sew the second seam. When you get to the third one, make extra sure that you're attaching it to the other side of the same sleeve, because it would be very frustrating if you accidentally closed up the back as if it were a sleeve and didn't notice until after you'd filled the seam allowances. Not that I've ever done that. Once all four sides of both gussets are sewn on, you can close up the side and sleeve seams. Fold the corners of the gussets up and out of the way before you start pinning so they don't get caught in the seam. The side seam needs to have a vent at the bottom, which will help it fit around your legs when you tuck your shirt in. The amount you leave open is up to you, but I'm doing 30 centimeters on mine. However much you leave open, remember to write it down. And for the sleeve, you'll need an opening at the wrist. I leave 12 centimeters open on mine. I find that's a good length for a sleeve that I can roll up, but this will differ depending on the thickness of your arms. If the edges of the sleeve are slightly different lengths, which they often are, measure up from the shorter one. If the ends of the seams are off by a millimeter or two at the corners of the gussets, that's okay. A bit of wonkiness there won't make much of a difference. On the side seam, clip into the seam allowance very slightly above the vent, maybe 4 or 5 millimeters. But on the sleeve, clip them about 1.5 centimeters up from that opening. And on the two corners of the gusset that meet the side and sleeve seams, clip into the seam allowances right at the corner, but only on the sleeve and body seam allowances. Leave the gusset alone. Do not trim or clip any seam allowance off the gusset ever. Trim the body and sleeve seam allowances underneath the gusset by slightly more than half, and trim one edge of the side and sleeve seam allowances in the same way. If there's one allowance that's a bit shorter or wonkier, then I suggest trimming that one. When you're trimming the sleeve seam allowance, clip off the corner at an angle, only on the seam allowance you've trimmed, right by the wrist opening. We need to fell the seam allowances on the sleeve and side seams before we can do the ones on the gussets. Pressing them is easier to do over a sleeve board or a sleeve roll if you have one. I like to press the seam open with my thumb before ironing the long seam allowance over the short one. Fold the edge under and pin it down. I don't use the iron on them after the second fold with linen because for some reason I find that tends to make the edge more wobbly. Press the edges of the vents back evenly, turn them under, and pin them too. If the end of the sleeve is uneven, like this one was, now is a good time to fix that. On the side seam you don't need to worry about the raw ends at the intersection because they'll be covered, but on the sleeve seam they won't be, so fold in the corners on all three of them. That's why we trimmed off the corner of the shorter seam allowance earlier. You don't absolutely positively have to baste these if you really don't want to. You could try sewing them with just the pins, but I strongly encourage you to try hand basting them. It doesn't take that much extra time, and it's made my felled seams and narrow hems so much easier and more even. It's especially good on the sleeve because then you won't have a tube full of pins bunched up around the presser foot. Make sure to secure those little folded corners well. When felling the side seams, I start the hem on the same side the seam allowance is pressed to, and just continue all the way up, and then do the hem on the other side separately. When felling the sleeves, I start from the hem on the opposite side of the seam allowances and cross over diagonally, doing a backstitch on the way to reinforce it a bit, and then do the other little hem afterwards. This does leave a weak point, but it's at the puffy end of the sleeve, so it doesn't really take any strain, and I've never had them tear on mine. Be sure to take all the basting up before moving on to the rest of the felling. The point at which the seam opens will take some strain if you roll up your sleeves, and I've had the fabric there get torn a few times, so you can reinforce it with a bar tack. Now that those seams are all done, we can finally finish off the underarm gussets. These are easiest to press on either a tailor's ham or the pointy end of your ironing board. Press the seam allowances of the gusset outwards and fold the edges under as usual. The corners on either end of the armhole binding are easy because they lie flat, but the ones on the sleeve and side seam have to go over an angled surface and need to be stretched a little. Be sure to line up those corners with the seam itself and not the felt edge. And baste it, of course. I can't force you to do that, but you really should. Like with the sleeve vent, you should make extra sure the corners are secure. I stab stitch the ones that overlap the armhole binding because there are so many layers of fabric there. When starting seams in the middle of something, I always worry about the end of the thread getting sucked into the machine and causing a terrible snarl, so I make a couple of stitches a few centimeters away from the start of the seam, to keep the thread tails out of the way. The gusset corners should have nicely covered up the ends of the side and sleeve seams. It took me far too many shirts to realize that it's best to felt the gusset edges outwards. I used to press all the seam allowances around it inwards for years, which was much more difficult and less clean looking. And I made it even worse by clipping into the seam allowance and leaving this horribly weak point, which may be okay for the end of the sleeve, but it is not okay for the underarm, and that spot was always the first part of my shirts to tear. So don't do that. Now we still have the bottom of the side seam to finish off and reinforce. For the smallest gusset, I only press in about 5mm around the edges. You can cut it a bit larger and fold it perfectly in half if you want to, but I prefer to fold it off-center like this. It goes right on top of those raw ends on the inside of the side seam, again lining up the corner with the seam itself and not the felt edge. Make sure they're all covered up and that the smaller half of the gusset is high enough to overlap those hemmed edges. If you clipped the side seam allowances too far above the vent opening, you might need a bigger gusset in order to cover the ends up. The vent ought to be splayed wide open so as to be parallel with the edges of the gusset. Like the heart patch, this is one area where I consider hand basting to be absolutely essential if you want to neatly machine sew it in. Top stitch it down along the outer edges of the gusset on the inside, and along the inner edges of that seam opening on the outside. This does leave quite a lot of visible backstitching within a small area, so you could tie off the threads by hand if that bothers you. I don't mind because nobody will ever see it, unless you're in the habit of wearing your shirt untucked, which I am not. I don't usually iron the hem on the bottom edge before sewing it. I find it easier to just fold it by hand, and I always baste it if I'm using linen because it's on the cross grain and has a bit of stretch, and I don't want it to get all skewed and puckered. Now it's time to put the wristbands on. Just like we did with the collar, I'm folding the ends of the sleeves in half, and then half again to mark out the quarters so that the gathers will be evenly distributed. I don't usually draw the stitching line on, but I will here. I'm drawing it 1.5 centimeters in from the long edge, a quarter of the width of the wristband, and on the ends I'm putting it 1 centimeter in, and marking the quarters in the same way. I didn't put the gathering stitches on the sleeves earlier because it would have gotten in the way of the hems. I'm trying to line up my gathers so that the sleeve will have a 1 centimeter seam allowance. As I was pinning this, I realized it would have been easier to line things up if I'd put the long stitching line on one side and all the shorter marks on the other side, but as mentioned, I don't usually mark them this much. As with my other gathers, I'm going over it with a long stitch first to avoid breaking my needle, and then sewing it again with a shorter stitch length, both from the wristband side, so I can go along the line I marked. Now press the wristband up and away from the sleeve and press the other seam allowance in. It should almost meet in the middle with the edge of the other seam allowance. I actually put these closer together than usual here, and it made the wristband a little bit bumpier, so I'd suggest leaving them about 3 mm apart, like I did on this gold shirt. Line up the edges of the wristband, right sides together, and sew the ends just like you did on the collar. Make sure the end of the little sleeve hem is out of the way. I like to trim the corner off the seam allowances here, and with fabric this weight you can cut off half the seam allowance on the end, but for a very lightweight gauzy fabric it's better to leave all of it. Another thing you can do to add a bit more structure to very lightweight fabric, such as this red cotton voile, is to sew the wristband on with a 1 cm seam allowance instead of the 1.5 I did on the other one. Then, after sewing up the ends, press the folded wristband so there's a crease right along the middle, and sew halfway between that folded edge and the ends of the seam allowances. I'm using a zipper foot here, so those bulky gathers don't get in the way. Sort of like you're making a pin tuck, but it all gets turned to the inside. Then you have the stability of an extra seam along that edge, without the fuss of having to cut it in 2 pieces. Now the collar and wristbands are both at the same stage, and we can close them all up. I never trim the seam allowances on the neck opening of the shirt, or the ends of the sleeves. I figured that having a bit more material in there is good, especially if your fabric is very thin, and I don't want to cut that nice folded edge off the neck gussets. It can be annoying trying to get the collar pinned down evenly, since it's so long, and folding and marking off the corners again can be helpful if you're having trouble with that. I would use fine linen thread if I had one in a close enough color, but I never do for the colored ones, so I'm using silk thread, doubled and waxed. I sew the inside edge down to the back side of the seam with small whip stitches. You can put the needle right underneath the machine stitches and get it lined up very nicely. This step can be done by machine though, and I did that on the sleeve ruffle sample that I make later in the video, so I'll show that part here. When pressing the long edge in and folding the wristband or collar right sides together, make sure the inside edge sticks out a little bit further past the seam. Sew the ends and turn and press as usual. Make sure that edge is protruding just enough to cover the seam. About 2 mm is a good amount. Then you can pin the underside, or hand baste it, and very carefully top stitch it from the outside, as close as you can get to the edge of the wristband. It should catch the underneath edge the whole way along. There is another version where you stitch in the ditch right along the seam, but maybe don't do that here. The gathers could get squashed and sad. I would stick with the tiny discreet top stitching if there are gathers involved. I actually kind of hate this method and I never use it, but it's pretty standard for the collars and cuffs on modern button-ups, and you can do it on your shirts if you want to. You'll get a nicely finished wristband that looks 18th century from a distance, but is much faster to sew. Now the only things left to do are the buttons and buttonholes. 18th century shirts typically have 2 buttons on the collar, or sometimes 3, and none on the wristbands because those fasten with sleeve links. If you're going for a believably 18th century look, the ones on the collar should be thread buttons. There's a variety of different kinds, and I'm not going to make all of them in this video. As I mentioned in the intro, I would like to do a hand-sewn shirt video at some indefinite point in the future, so when I do that I will probably make a whole separate video just on button options. But for this video I'll just make one kind, and link tutorials for the others in the blog post. Dorset wheels are probably the most well-known type of thread button these days, and there are quite a few tutorials for them online. You make them over a little ring, and I've made a bunch using cheap plastic rings from Fabricville, but for my gold shirt I tried metal ones. I am a little concerned about the fact that these have a square cross section, which gives them fairly sharp edges, and since these are the first 2 I've made this way, I don't know how they'll hold up, so I'll have to make some more everyday shirts with them and report back in a year or 2. Bird's eye buttons are another option. These ones are 100% thread, although I actually used linen yarn because it's a lot chunkier. And this one has a core of fabric. I found this kind more difficult than the thread ones, and my first few attempts turned out really squishy, but I suppose I just need more practice. And these ones are Dorset knobs. This kind has detached buttonhole stitch on it. There are other variations, but I haven't tried them. Close-up reference pictures are relatively few and far between, but overall I get the impression that the Dorset knobs and other rounder ones were more popular earlier in the century, and the flatter Dorset wheels are more late 18th century, which does track with the way buttons in general changed over the century. With some exceptions, they tend to be smaller and rounder in the earlier decades, and then gradually spread out so that by the 1780s and 90s they're very flat. I love late 18th century fashion, but I've been in more of an early to mid 18th century mood lately, so I chose Dorset knobs for the teal shirt. I've seen one picture of a historical one with a horn mold inside it, and I don't have any reproduction horn molds. I do have some bone molds, but they're very thick and expensive, so I prefer to use these little resin spacer beads. I also have some coconut shell ones for darker material. For these buttons, I'm using a 1cm resin bead. I start out by making an ordinary fabric covered button. I trace a circle that's twice as wide as my mold, cut it with a tiny bit of seam allowance, and fold in the edge. I gather it up with a running stitch and put the bead in. Then I sew those little bumps together tightly, like so. For more information on cloth-covered buttons, watch the video I made about them a couple years ago. Next, I'm going to cover it with thread. I prefer to use heavy linen thread for these, but I don't have any that's remotely close to this color, so instead I'm using the same cotton pearl I used for the bar tack on the front. I cut quite a long thread and wax the entire thing, which I always do for thread buttons because it helps make them stronger. I tie a knot and start off with a sharp needle, so I can anchor the thread by sticking it through from the smooth side, and then back down again. I then switch to a blunt needle so I can go between the threads instead of through them. I do blanket stitches all around the bottom. I don't count how many, I just make them a good smallish distance apart. Then I do detached buttonhole stitch the rest of the way up. As I get closer to the top, I decrease by occasionally skipping over a stitch. Once it's all covered, I switch back to a sharp needle and bring the thread to the back to tie it off. You might need pliers to get it through. Make sure the collar and wristbands are right side out and nicely ironed before starting the buttonholes. For garments with long rows of buttons, I make sure they're carefully measured, but for shirts I just eyeball it. I decide what button placement looks nice on the collar and then draw the lines about 5mm in from the edge. I center them on the wristbands, also 5mm from the edge. I usually do my shirt buttonholes by machine first and then cover them with hand stitches, but if you want to do them entirely by hand, I have a whole video on that as well. Lining up machine buttonholes with the marked line is the part I find most difficult about making shirts. My attachment doesn't do them exactly in the center of the foot. It also doesn't lift up quite high enough to completely clear the thick wristbands, and they're so narrow that it's painfully obvious if the buttonhole is even a little bit off. I go around only once on a narrower setting, and then cut them open. If I were just doing them by machine, I would go around a second time on a wider setting. At this point I try the shirt on to make sure the wristbands are the right length and the sleeve links fit through the holes. The wristbands are the most fiddly part to fit, and sometimes I have to clip the holes open a bit bigger, which is okay because I'm just using the machine buttonholes as the overcasting step. I also stick the collar buttons through the holes to make sure they're long enough. Remember that the buttonholes will be slightly tighter once you've sewn over them. I tried marking the collar here for demonstration purposes, but it looked awful and I don't actually do that anymore. I already know I've made the collar 1 centimeter longer than I want the finished circumference to be, and I just put the ends of the buttonholes 5mm in from the edges. I mark the button locations through the holes, also 5mm from the edge, which gives me the 1 centimeter overlap. But if this is your first shirt, then I would suggest very carefully pinning it closed. If it doesn't fit, you can always move the buttons. If your collar turns out way too small and you can't get it to overlap at all, you could make a whole new collar if you want to, but you can save the short one while still being historical. Just put a buttonhole on both sides of the collar and tie a ribbon through them. This appears to have been fairly popular in the late 17th to early 18th century, and then it sort of peters out by the mid-century, but the latest image I've seen of it is from 1803. They've usually only got one buttonhole on each side, so maybe try the shirt on before sewing the buttonholes if you're worried about the collar being too small, but I have seen one example where there are 2 holes on each side, and that one's got a thin cord instead of a ribbon. I made this one a couple years ago and I put the buttonholes 2/5 of the way up, and I found it doesn't sit very well on the neck without the overlap in buttons, but once you put some neckwear over it, it's fine, and you can completely hide the ribbons underneath the neckwear if you want to. So don't despair if your collar meets edge to edge, just get 1/2 meter of ribbon. I have a section for all the examples I've seen in my shirts Pinterest board, which is linked in the description. There's quite a variety of different colors of ribbon. I didn't mention any of this in the cutting section because I didn't want to overcomplicate things by getting into too many different style options, but I thought I should mention it here just in case. So once I'm satisfied that things will fit, I do the buttonhole stitches. I wax only the starting end of the thread, bury it in between the layers of fabric, and then do buttonhole stitches along the edges and a bar tack at each end, though I don't always bother with the bar tack on shirt buttonholes. As mentioned, I have another video just about buttonholes where I go into a lot more detail, so I will link that in the description too. And then you just have to sew the buttons on, which is the same method I've shown in both my covered button videos. Not having any suitable linen thread, I'm sewing these on with polyester. I find polyester very annoying to hand sew with because it's so twisty, but my fine silk thread is not strong enough to hold buttons on. Take little bites out of the back of the button and through the thing you're sewing it to, making sure you leave about a 3mm gap so you can wrap the thread around all those other little threads to form a shank. Now it just needs a good soak to wash out all that marker ink. And that is a plain shirt finished. I've tried to make it so that my instructions work for reasonably historically accurate looking shirts while still leaving more fantastical options open. This one is completely hand sewn and this one is mostly by machine, with the same amount of hand finishing as the teal shirt. I can tell the difference from this far away, but not from this far away. If the front slit had a facing, it would be much more obvious, but with the hem and reinforcement patch, it's pretty inconspicuous. I said I would talk more about fabric later in the video, so I will do that before I get to the ruffle section. The fabric that's available to you will depend a lot on where you live though, so my specific fabric sources will not be helpful for everyone. I make most of my shirts out of Summer Breeze weight linen from Pure Linen Envy. I like this shop because it's right here in Canada, so the shipping is not so horrible, and because they have a lot of colors. Summer Breeze is the middle weight of the 3 main linens they carry, but Featherlight works too if you want a really fine one. That's what I used for this shirt, though the lighter colors are a bit see-through. Their everyday linen is a little too thick for this kind of shirt. This one's made of a linen from Fabricville in a similar weight, and it's just too bulky. too much material in the gathers and too much to tuck into your pants, or fit into tight coat sleeves. Modern linens tend to be a bit shifty and wiggly, as they are much more loosely woven than historical ones, which is why I do so much basting on my linen shirts, especially with the pieces cut on the cross grain, which have a bit of stretch. If you use a tightly woven cotton, it won't drape as nicely as the linen, but it will be easier to work with. The sample I made for the sleeve ruffle is cotton, and I didn't even pin the seam allowances down before felling them. I just pressed them. For your first ever shirt, you'll probably want to go with a cheaper fabric, and thrifted bed sheets are a great way to get a large amount of nice quality cotton for very cheap. The top sheets are better because the fitted ones are missing their corners and are usually more worn out. I haven't actually made any shirts out of bed sheets, but I do like to use them for nightgowns, which have almost the exact same construction. I go for the really fine, tightly woven 100% cotton ones. These are a nightmare to pull threads on, but they're less wiggly, so you can draw rectangles with a ruler more easily. And unlike linen, you can tear the larger pieces, as long as you give them a few extra centimeters, and then cut off all the scruffy edges. And a lot of the really soft sateen ones have a subtle woven stripe, so you can just cut along that. They also tend to come in really nice colors. But while those cottons don't really need much basting, a lighter weight one like this voile definitely will. This will give you a very delicate, translucent shirt, and you'll be able to gather much more material into the collar and wristbands. I would also strongly advise basting for anything really wiggly, like rayon. I made this one out of rayon crepe back in 2017, and I don't remember if I basted much of it, but if not, I should have. If you are going for historical accuracy, then you should try to get linen, preferably in plain white, but for some kinds of working class shirts you might want unbleached or woven blue, stripe, or plaid. But if you're not going for accuracy, then use whatever you want, as long as it's not too bulky. As for thread, I usually use Gutermann polyester for my colored shirts, because it comes in a lot of colors, and it's not bad. I don't like to use it for the white ones though, because the optic white is too bright and the ivory is too dark. I've used Gutermann cotton thread for a few shirts, but I don't like it all that much because it's really stiff. Although it might be the wrong kind, and maybe Fabricville just doesn't carry a wide enough variety of cotton thread, I don't know. I think I used this red cotton Mettler stuff for my red voile shirt, and it's pretty nice. But I got it from a store that closed years ago, and Fabricville doesn't carry it. But recently I came across Aurifil cotton 50 weight in a quilting shop, and it's lovely. I don't know yet how well it holds up to long-term wear, but it's so soft and fine. It's a bit pricey, but there's 1,300 meters on this spool, so I definitely recommend getting one if you machine sew a lot of fine weight historical underthings. Next time I'm near the quilt shop, I'll go get another one in black. I have tried using silk thread for machine sewing shirts, but it really doesn't wear well. The seams start coming apart long before the fabric, so I prefer to keep it for the hand finishing. It's a bit stronger when it's doubled and waxed. Linen thread is great for hand sewing, but sadly it's much too uneven to put through a machine. And I like crochet cotton for the buttonholes, but there's more on that in the buttonhole video. If you're making your ruffles out of fabric, it should be finer than the shirt fabric. In a lot of portraits and on some extant shirts, you can see that the ruffles are translucent and distinctly different from the shirt fabric. I've made ruffles in the same fabric as the shirt a few times, and it's just not very nice. Especially with modern linens being so much coarser than historical ones, the ruffles just look kind of clunky. Of course, this makes it difficult if you're using a colored fabric and need to find a finer material in the same shade, but for black or white it's pretty easy. I highly recommend cotton organdy because it's fine and crisp, and it stays crisp through multiple washings. If you just buy a meter, it should last you for quite a few shirts. Be careful though, because the cheaper ones can sometimes be extremely off-grain, which is no good when you want nice even rectangles. Best to get a swatch first, if possible. These ones are from Renaissance Fabrics, and I think I will buy some of this one, and definitely some of this one, but not this one. Don't use silk organza, it will not stay crisp after washing, it will get very soft and swooshy. For these samples I'll be using cotton lawn from my stash, which is not as stiff, but it still makes nice fine ruffles. And if you're looking to use lace, cottonlace.com has some really wonderful stuff. I haven't used any of these on shirts yet, but oh, they're so nice. An 18th century shirt should take about 2 meters of lace, or 3 at the very most, which is good because the larger widths are fairly pricey. If you're going for a historical look and your only options are plain fabric ruffles or cheap nylon lace, I would suggest going with the plain fabric ones, because I find that nylon lace never looks quite right. But if you're not going for a historically accurate look, then you can sew whatever you want. I am not here to crush your dreams. I was going to show some synthetic lace here for comparison, but I gave it all to a friend and I don't have any left. If you want to add ruffles to your shirt, you can either hand sew them on after the entire thing is finished, or machine sew them into the shirt earlier in construction. I prefer to hand sew mine because I think it looks nicer and it means I can easily remove them without leaving any little bits of fabric behind, but because this is the machine sewn version of my shirt, I'm going to resist the urge to do that in this video. Burnley and Trowbridge have videos on how to do these tiny little hand-rolled hems, and on doing rolled whip gathers, so I will link those in the blog post. But for this video, I'm just going to do some samples by machine. The length of your ruffle will depend on how long the edge you're attaching it to is, and how gathered you want it to be. You'll have to measure the edge in question, and multiply it by whichever number you choose. I made this sample to show what the ruffles look like at 1.5 times the length, 2 times, 2.5 times, and 3 times. I encourage you to make one of these for yourself, as it's good practice and a very useful reference to have on your wall. You can compare it to reference pictures if you're trying to copy something specific. In this portrait, the chest ruffle looks like about 1.5 times, while the wrist ruffles look like at least 3. I'm pulling threads to get my cutting lines, just like the rest of the shirt, which is easy to do on the cotton lawn. I cut this strip pretty wide so I can hem either edge and split it into 2 ruffles later, but if I were aiming for ruffles of a particular width, I would cut them about 1.8 centimeters wider than that. To finish them, I'm using a hemming foot. These come in a few different widths, and this one is quite narrow. If you don't have one for your machine, I highly recommend getting one. You can also fold in the edge and sew it down without one, just like I did for the other narrow hems on the shirt, but that will be a lot slower. I had actually never used this foot before, but found a video that showed me how to do it. You sew a few stitches into the edge of the fabric, then pull on the thread tails and fold the edge in as you guide it into the foot. I fold it in about 7 millimeters, because the foot makes a hem that's half that width. Then you sew while continuing to fold the edge down. I'm angling it slightly to the left, so none of it gets caught under the right side of the foot. It took some practice to get the hang of it, but the wonky hems I did first all ended up in my ruffle samples, which is another good reason to do samples. If not enough fabric is folded over, then you get a little frayed edge instead of a nice fold, but if too much goes in, then it makes an ugly wrinkle. It was a bit tricky getting the fold a consistent width, especially with my machine not being able to go slowly, but then I tried folding and pressing in the edge before sewing, and that was a huge improvement. It made it go so much more smoothly, and I was able to put it through the machine at top speed. Unlike the cotton lawn, organdy is much too stiff to pull threads out of, but it tears pretty cleanly along the grain. So you can just tear it into long strips and trim off the little frayed ends afterwards. Instead of ironing the edge over, I creased it with a bone folder and pressed it down by hand. When putting these ones through the machine, I was quite frustrated at first, because I was ending up with even more of those puckers. I eventually found that the organdy needs a smaller amount folded over in order to make a nice hem. About 4 or 5 millimeters, instead of the 6 or 7 I did for the lawn. If your hems are really terrible, you can cut them off and try again. But I think I'll put these on a nightgown, since the hems don't have any raw edges peeking out. The machine hem on the left is not as fine as the hand hem on the right, but still pretty good. I've rolled these up and put them in a bag, with all my other currently unattached ruffles. If you want to add wrist ruffles by machine, the wristbands will each need to be cut as 2 pieces instead of 1. I'm drawing out wristbands that will be 1.5 centimeters wide, as usual, but I'm giving them only 5 millimeters of seam allowance on each side, because I don't want it to get too bulky in there. I would pull threads if this sample was linen, but it's a relatively stiff cotton, so I didn't bother. Wrist ruffles ought to be quite full, so I'm cutting this one 3 times the length that my finished wristband will be, but I think it could still stand to be a bit fuller. Holding the hemmed strip up against the wristband pieces is a perfectly fine way to measure, just as long as you cut both ruffles the same size. Depending on the material, it might be easier to hem the ends by hand, but the lawn was easy enough to do by machine. Press a tiny double fold along the ends, being careful to use just the edge of the iron, because it turns out the corners can get squished if they get caught in one of the steam holes. I pinned the end because I was worried it might get distorted. Don't backstitch here, tie off the threads by hand. Switching to a stronger polyester thread and the longest stitch length, I'm sewing my usual 2 lines of gathering stitches along the raw edge of the ruffle. The quarters ought to be marked on the ruffle and the wristband, just like the other gathered seams, once again making sure to not include the seam allowances at the ends of the wristbands in the quartering. Then it can be lined up and pinned, just like we did with the end of the sleeve on the plain shirt. I put my gathering lines a bit too far in for such a small seam allowance. I should have sewn the gathers closer to the edge, but of course it would be easier to sew closer to the edge if my machine could go slowly. And this bit gets sewn in quite a similar way to the top of the sleeve in the armhole binding. I attach the first half of the wristband with a longer stitch, and then add the second with a shorter stitch once the pins are all out of the way. Now it should look like this. Sew it onto the end of the sleeve the same way as you would on a plain shirt. Make sure that the right sides of the ruffle and the sleeve are facing each other, so the smooth side of the ruffle hems will face out. If you want to, you can understitch by sewing through just the underside of the wristband and the seam allowance, but I don't think it's necessary for something so narrow. You can finish off the inside of the wristband by hand like I did on the teal shirt, but I did it by machine on this sample, as you already saw in the wristband section. As completely machine-sewn wristbands go, I think this is pretty darn good. If you want to machine sew ruffles onto the front, you will need to leave the front slit closed when you first cut out the body. Draw a line down the front as long as you want the slit to be, but don't cut it yet. I'm doing 30 centimeters here. Now you'll need to cut a facing. I made this one 5 centimeters wide and 4 centimeters longer than the marked line. For the wrist sample I hemmed a strip on one side, but for the front slit ruffle you'll need to hem a wider strip on both sides. I cut this one 14.5 centimeters wide, which gave me a pair of 6.5 centimeter wide ruffles. You'll need to mark a spot at least 1 centimeter down from the top edge, to account for the seam allowance that will end up inside the collar, and a gap of about the same size up from the bottom of the line. The bosom ruffles tend to be less gathered than the wrist ones, so I'm only cutting this one 2 times the length, and hemming the ends just as before. Mark a line down the middle of the ruffle. For a regular gathered seam we use 2 lines of gathering stitches so you can sew in between them, and here we're doing 2 gathered seams, which means we'll need 3 lines of gathering. I put them all about 1 centimeter apart. If you're using 2 strips of lace, you might try overlapping the edges slightly, machine basting them together, and using that as your middle row of gathering. The ruffle and the line the ruffle will be sewn to should have the quarters marked on them, just like everything else. Always make sure you're grabbing the threads from the same side of the fabric when pulling on your gathers. Then line up the center of the ruffle and match all the quarter marks. Remember that it doesn't go all the way to the ends of the line, you still need that centimeter gap on either end. Which way you put the hems is up to you, but I've laid the smoother side down because when the ruffles are sticking out of a waistcoat front, that's the side that's more visible. I don't want to put my facing on with all those pins under there, so to make it easier I'm just going to machine baste on top of all 3 lines of gathering. The facing should have a line the same length as the one marked on the front of the shirt, and it's helpful to draw a stitching line on either side, about 5 millimeters away, plus a little curve at the bottom. Then I can pin the facing on top of the gathers and sew a very long U shape on it. Make the stitch length a tiny bit shorter when pivoting around the bottom. Cut down the middle line and carefully clip the curve in a few places so it will turn smoothly. Remove the basting stitches that are holding the ruffle down and press the facing to the inside. You can leave the bottom squared off if you want, but I think it looks much better if it's cut into a point. Then you just need to fold under all the edges of the facing and top stitch them down. You can also understitch it first if you want the facing to stay more securely to the inside, or even top stitch through all the layers around that edge, but it should be fine without that, unless your fabric is very shifty and slinky. If this were linen, I would probably baste the facing down first, just like I did with the armhole binding, but this is a sturdy cotton, so I won't. You could go even narrower with the facing, and the narrower the better if you don't want it to look too obviously machine made. I still strongly recommend adding the usual bar tack. And there we go, lovely bosom ruffles. A bit more obviously machine sewn than the wrist ruffles on account of the facing, but still better than most of the 18th century shirts in movies and TV shows. And here I need to restate that if you are hand sewing the whole thing, please do not use this method. Just follow the hand sewing tutorials I linked in the blog post. The rolled whip gather is a beautiful thing. I used this facing method on my first 2 machine sewn shirts, which was fine, but I also did it that way on my first 3 hand sewn ones. It would have been so much easier to do it the historical way, but I didn't know that, so I just tried to copy the machine method by hand, which is a thing that frequently happens when somebody's trying to sew something by hand, but they're only familiar with the machine sewn version. They'll just try and copy the machine method by hand, and that usually takes more effort and gives you a worse result, because hands and machines work very differently. Like if you're trying to do buttonholes by hand, but you only have machine sewn ones for reference, you might try just stab stitching up and down a whole bunch of times, which is terrible. The methods that are most efficient for machines are usually completely different from the ones that are most efficient for hand sewing. So please do try to find hand sewing instructions for whatever specific thing you're doing. If you're using sleeve links and need to roll up your sleeves, you can take them off and put them in your pocket, or you can leave them in on one end and just roll them up inside the sleeves. They're pretty secure in there and will make a faint jingling sound when you move. I've been wearing sleeve links pretty much every day for years now and have not lost one yet. At this point in the video, I would normally talk about the things I could improve on, and I thought I wouldn't have to do that here because I've made so many shirts, but then I foolishly put the wristband seam allowances a little closer together than usual. So that is the one thing I would do differently. I would put them 3mm apart like I did on the gold shirt, instead of right up against each other like I did on this one. I have made many mistakes on previous shirts, and I've mentioned a lot of them already in this video. But another one was that I used to put facings on the fronts of non-ruffled shirts when I could have just hemmed them. I would only use a facing now if I were going to machine sew ruffles on. I also used to cut my hem and neck gussets as pairs of separate triangles on the grain instead of just folding squares in half, but that one at least I can blame on the fact that I was using this 1981 magazine article as a reference, and it gets a lot of stuff wrong. I think their extant shirt might be early 19th century rather than 18th, or at least heavily altered. They also advise you to commit heinous neckwear crimes. Turns out that 40-year-old resources can sometimes be inaccurate. I've also tried finishing the armhole seam allowances in different ways, and it just doesn't work as well with the gathers. Much cleaner and easier to cover it with a strip of fabric. I still think the worst one was the way I used to finish underarm gussets. Those shirts could have lasted so much longer if I'd done it a stronger way. And I don't know how I kept on doing wide cuffs for so long when looking at so many images with narrow wristbands. I guess looking does not necessarily mean observing. At least these all seem to be pretty common beginner mistakes for this kind of shirt, which makes me feel a bit better about it. Another really common one is when people close up the sleeve and do the side seam and then set the sleeve in afterwards. I can't remember if I've ever done that, but I've seen so many people do it, and it hurts to watch. You're making a very easy step way more difficult than it needs to be. Obviously that doesn't apply to things like tailored jackets and coats. For those, you do need to finish the sleeve separately and then set it in, but for anything that's unstructured, one layer, not super fitted, and has seams that line up here, just put the sleeve on first. Shirts, shifts, nightgowns, do that seam first and finish it while everything is still nice and flat, and then close up the side and sleeve all in one go. If you observe the underarm of any factory-made button-up, you will see that they're all done like that. Okay, this one's about 100 years old, but it's the only factory-made shirt I have, and you can see how the sleeve was sewn on and felled first, and then the sleeve seam and the side seam were closed up all in one. And the modern button-ups I alter at work are done the exact same way. I'm very glad I finally tried using the narrow hem foot. It was not so tricky as I imagined. Definitely get one if you want to do a lot of ruffles very quickly, and make one of these samples. I think I'll try making a shirt or two that's machine sewn with machine hemmed ruffles, but still sew the ruffles on by hand. I don't know how long the teal shirt took, but I tracked the time for the gold one and it was 14.5 hours. But that includes doing the buttonholes completely by hand and making 2 Dorset wheel buttons. If I'd done the holes by machine and used pre-existing buttons, it would probably only be about 12 or 13 hours. And it would take a bit longer to do one with ruffles, but not too much longer if they were all by machine. I want to emphasize that you do not need to sew your shirt the exact same way I do. I prefer to flat fell my shirt seams, but if you prefer to finish the edges with a serger or a zigzag stitch, that's okay. Just finish them some sort of way so they don't come apart in the wash. There's no one correct way to sew things, and you should do whatever works best for you. But if you do serge or zigzag them, it'll be stronger if you still press the seam allowances to one side and sew them down flat. Speaking of machines, I have another one now, but it also needs some work. I don't know yet what I'm going to do with the Singer, but I might try converting it to hand crank. Despite being my longest video so far, this is still not everything I have to say about shirts, but I will save the rest for my hand-sewn shirt video, which will not be anytime soon, definitely not this year, but I will make one eventually. Again, check out the blog post for more hand-sewing resources. Thank you for watching, thank you again to my patrons for making this video possible, and I hope you make some shirts. Bye!